Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And I'm your host, Janet Kier Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin. And today we are interviewing Stanton T. Friedman. Stanton is a nuclear physicist, lecturer, who received his BSc and MSc degrees in physics from the University of Chicago in 55 and 56. He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist by such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas, working in such highly advanced classified, eventually canceled programs as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and various compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial application. He became interested in UFOs in 58, and since 67 has lectured about them at more than 600 colleges and 100 professional groups in 50 U.S. states, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries, in addition to various nuclear consulting efforts, and he has published more than 90 UFO papers and has appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs, including Larry King in 2007 and twice in 2008, and many documentaries. He is the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident and co-authored Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident. Top Secret Magic, his controversial book about the Majestic 12 group established in 1947 to deal with alien technology, was published in 96 and went through 6 printings. So he is the Lifetime UFO Achievement Award in Leeds in 2002, plus I saw him get an award in 2013 at the International UFO Congress. He co-authored with Kathleen Martin, who is Betty Hale's niece, a book in 2007 called Captured, the Betty and Barney Hale UFO Experience. And the city of Fredericton, New Brunswick declared August 27, 2007, Stanton Friedman Day. He had his own day. And his book, Flying Saucers and Science, was published in 2008. And his newest book is with co-author Kathleen Martin, Science Was Wrong. It was released in June 2010. And finally, he has provided testimony to congressional hearings. He has appeared twice at the UN and has been a pioneer in many aspects of ufology, including Roswell, Majestic 12, the Betty Hale Marjorie Fish star map work, analysis of the Delphos, Kansas physical trace case, crash saucers, flying saucer technology, and challenges to the SETI silly effort to investigate cultists. He has spoken at more MUFON symposia than anyone else. And Dr. Lessin, what would you like to say about our show today?
Okay, yeah. I'm an anthropologist, and in this stage of my life, I'm what's called an ethnologist. That's an anthropologist that sort of puts together everything that he's learned his whole professional career and tries to make some kind of big sense out of it. And I realized that everybody, in a way, does that, and you'll see Stanton did that particularly, but that Paul Radin in anthropology has shown that people in every culture reflect and sort of get the bigger picture together. So today we have somebody who is, I think, if you look at a universe, instead of causally, you sort of say that the results you got might be in a synchronistic program, and we would ask each speaker, what are the critical incidents that made you Stanton who you are now? What past life scripts are operating? What archetypes have you identified with? Just, how did you come to manifest as you are manifesting now, and what have you learned?
Welcome to the show.
And I have 3 hours to tell you all that, huh? or is it 6 hours? I forget.
We'll cover what we can.
Well, it is. Look, if you had asked me or suggested in 1965, let's say, that I would wind up being a full-time ufologist and given over 700 lectures, I'd have laughed my head off. I was happy working in industry on exciting programs, nuclear airplanes and fission rockets and fusion rockets and stuff like that. I stumbled across UFOs only because I'm a cheapskate. You talk about key events. I was ordering books from Marlboro Books, my wife and I needed one more book so I wouldn't have to pay shipping. And I was going down this long list of books, and there's one, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt, who had headed Project Blue Book in the early 50s. And I didn't have an opinion on UFOs because I didn't know anything about them. I was a young nuclear physicist working on nuclear airplanes for GE. But Air Force was a co-sponsor of our program, so what the heck? They ought to know what they're talking about. That's what I thought then. I'm not so sure now. So I ordered the book. It was $2.95, marked down to $1, a hardcover book, and it wasn't going to cost me anything because if I didn't order the book, shipping would have been $1. So I read the book. It didn't convince me, but it intrigued me, and I loaned the book to my neighbor. Charlie was an engineer 10 years older than I was, and he was more impressed than I was, and I was impressed by that because I was impressed with Charlie. And 10 years later, he attended a lecture I gave in an electrical engineering conference in Connecticut, and the first thing he and his wife said was, "We knew you when you didn't believe in flying saucers." So that was the first sort of unusual event. And I moved to California, and a second one happened. I read about 10 more books out there, and I'm at the University of California, Berkeley Library, and I find something, Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. Now, that was strange because, A, it wasn't mentioned in any of the books that I'd read, 10 books, and you'd think one of them would have mentioned it. B, it was chock full of data, charts, tables, graphs, maps, more than 100 of them. And C, the thing that really caught my eye, the guy who put this thing together was a government report, Air Force, had included the press release that was sent out at the time the volume was completed in 1955. They didn't send out the report, but they sent the press release everywhere. And in the press release, here is the following quote from the Secretary of the Air Force. Now, you can't get a higher authority than that, I guess. He said, on the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Well, that sounds very straightforward. The only trouble was I had the report, and I'm a data hound, as I say, looking at all. It's got information on 3,201 sightings. The work was done by, it's a big study and charts tables. The work was done by Battelle Memorial Institute, a major research and development firm, under contract to the United States Air Force Project Blue Book. And the only trouble with his statement by the Secretary of the Air Force was that the unknowns weren't 3% or 4% or 10%. They were 21.5%. And they weren't the ones for which there wasn't enough information. There was a separate category for them, 9.3%. And they did a quality evaluation of all the sightings. And the better the quality, the more likely to be unexplainable. And I'm only interested in the unexplainable ones. Also, they asked an obvious question when you got a mass of data. Is there really any difference between the unknowns and the knowns? Maybe we just missed the boat in the screening process. Let's check. They did a chi-squared statistical analysis for people who were interested in that sort of thing. What they found was that the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. So I was angry. I don't like being lied to, especially by somebody with as high or lofty a position as the Secretary of the Air Force. And that determined me, I want to find out what's going on here. So I joined APRO and NICAP, the two major groups at the time, both long gone. Talked to my colleagues at work and so forth. Another job got canceled, so I moved to Indianapolis, got to know, I worked for General Motors there, Allison Division, and the man who moved me on, so to speak, was a guy named Frank Edwards. he was the journalist, but he wrote the book Flying Saucers: Serious Business. And I had gotten to know Frank, and he gave me a copy of his book. And then I moved on to Pittsburgh to work for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab. It was kind of a problem. I wanted to go public, I finally figured. And so I asked Frank. He knew everybody. He was a well-known journalist. And he gave me some names. One of them was the producer for a radio talk show called Contact, of all things.
Wow.
And that's what the name was. And it was on the biggest station in Pittsburgh, KDKA.
Yes.
And, they're big time. And I called thinking that because I worked for Westinghouse, after all, a Westinghouse nuclear physicist ought to be gold-plated credentials in Pittsburgh. Well, they are if you want to buy a house and want to get a loan, but the guy I talked to said, don't call us, we'll call you. Oh, well, less than a month later, he called me because somebody canceled at the last minute. And I've often wondered how many people did he call before he got somebody who would go on the show. He calls at 6:30, would I do the show at 7, please? And you had to go down to the station at that time, Wow. And I lived not far from the station, so I agreed. And I went on, and somebody at work, synchronicities, whatever, a woman at work had a book review club, and she heard me on the radio, and she called me, Stan, how about talking to our book review club? We're reviewing Frank's book. Okay, so my first lecture was in her living room, and It went well, and I did that show again on a number of occasions, and gee whiz, I started getting lots of lectures, and another synchronicity event. I mean, I'm driving to work one of 2 days when my car was in the garage, and I lived downtown, and the woman I drove to work with, Joanne, was a supervisor at Westinghouse, had a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. And we're talking, and I said, gee, I'd really like to speak out at Carnegie Mellon. And she says, well, have you talked to the dean? And I said, no. She says, Stan, the dean's my husband. Why don't you give him a call? He's heard you on the radio. Okay. So I call her husband, and we book a lecture because he had heard me and stuff. And we set a date, like 3 weeks or so later, but it was an afternoon talk. That meant I'd have to take some time off at Westinghouse. Well, his last question was, how much do you want? And I thought, gee, gotta lose some money. How about $100? Thinking he'd knock me down to 50. What did I know? Sold. But then he told me, because I knew his wife, what he was paying the other speakers in the series. $1,500, $1,700, $1,600. But he was good. The lecture went extremely well. Good crowd, good questions, a lot of interest. And so he wrote a nice letter to the agent through whom he had booked the other speakers. And incidentally, I booked a lecture 2 years ago through that same agent. This was back in '67, mind you. The guy's still booking speakers. But anyway, the agent booked me at a very important talk for me, the Engineering Society of Detroit. And it was not only because it was $300 in expenses, but because, that's a very respectable organization. Even if I buy Japanese cars, still Engineering Society of Detroit is okay. And it turned out they were sold out, to my surprise, 3 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. And there wasn't one negative question. Well, to say I was inspired by this is an understatement. I had to respect those people, you see. And so I asked my boss at Westinghouse, I need some guidelines here. I don't want to lose my job or my security clearance. I don't want to get into trouble. What are the rules? So they came back to me with 3 rules. You can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. you can say what you please on your time, but we'd like you to start your lecture with a disclaimer. The views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone, and not those of my employer. Fine. What more could I ask for? Well, turns out there was one more thing I could ask for. I got a call from a colleague at Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory in New Mexico. He was working on nuclear rocket shielding, and so was I. And he calls me and says, Stan, how about speaking to the local section of the American Nuclear Society? Oh, I'd be delighted. No, I mean on an expense account, Stan. Oh, well, I don't make those decisions. So I talked to management. Would you believe they paid for me to go from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Los Alamos, New Mexico to give a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real, to the American Nuclear Society section in Los Alamos. Over 500 people, not one negative question. So I was feeling good about speaking and so forth, and then came a shocker. You have no control over your life. I swear you don't. I don't need to tell you guys that. You know that.
Right.
But
yes.
we had an extremely successful test on a nuclear rocket engine we were testing out at the nuclear test site in Nevada. Everything went great, and I was worried, frankly, because they had come to me 2 weeks before. We need to know what the heating rates are in the control vanes. We don't want to melt them. I agreed, we don't want to melt them. So I was able to make some measurements, made plans the next day, experiment the next day, and gave them the data. They were delighted. But I was worrying all during that test. What if I was wrong? The control vanes melt. I'm in bad trouble. Well, they didn't. Everything went well. It was a very successful test. But less than a year later, they canceled the program. What can I say? And, when you say strange things happen, okay, I look around for a job. I get a nice job offer from McDonnell Douglas in Santa Monica, California. And my job was going to be the plum job in the world. It was going to be my job to figure out how flying saucers worked. Wow. So McDonnell Douglas could build a bunch, I guess. And so I was pleased, good pay. I'm driving across the country, left my family at home so I can get established out there. And halfway out, I hear on the radio, the program for which I would be working, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory Programs, the Air Force MOLE program, was canceled. I walk in and the gal at the desk says, show her my offer letter and stuff. We just laid off 5,000 people, she said. Yeah, I know. So they kept me for 3 months, which was nice. And I did do one interesting thing. I had a literature search done on using one word, magnetoaerodynamics, because I think that's how the saucers move in the atmosphere. And I was shocked to get 900 references, and 90% were classified. And so somebody was spending time and money on magnetoaerodynamics. Anyway, that taught me a lesson, though. I've got to look after myself. And I had a short-term job at TRW Systems, but I was calling colleges. Again, being a cheapskate, when you're on the West Coast, it's 7 in the morning, but it's 10 back east, so you can call colleges. I'm an early bird. What are we doing talking late at night? I don't know. But I made my calls, I booked my lectures, and I've been going at it ever since. I haven't done any mailings to colleges in the last few years. I go to conferences, but I'm keeping active and keeping busy.
Yeah.
And next month is a very busy month. The Contact in the Desert in California.
Yes.
And so the main thing that you want humanity to know from all that you're experienced is What's the main thing?
Yeah, you've been doing this for how many years now? Have you been doing this?
Well, I started in 67 was when I gave my first lecture,
67?
so that's 49 years.
Wow.
49 years. And what was your question?
Putting it all together in its larger context, and you've got a huge context because you've gone through so much data. What's it all about, Stanton?
What's what?
What's it all about? What are your conclusions of?
Oh, okay.
You've done 49
yes.
years of research.
Yeah, my conclusions are, well, there's four of them, four major ones. One, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underlined and capitalized, underlined 18 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. Most isotopes aren't fissionable, but when I worked on nuclear reactors, I was glad there was one that was.
Mm-hmm.
The second conclusion is that we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate. In other words, some few people within government know what's going on. Most do not. You don't keep secrets by telling everybody. I had a clearance for 14 years, and I kept secrets. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first two. And the fourth conclusion is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Now, I said millennium singular because I don't want to get into religious arguments. If I said millennia, other people will argue what happened 2,000 years ago was a bigger deal and so forth. So with those conclusions, I have found a couple of subsidiary conclusions. One of them is, having lectured in 18 countries and 50 states and 10 provinces, there's an enormous amount of interest in flying saucers, or what a scientist has to say about flying saucers. The second is, most scientists are not well informed about UFOs. They're quite willing to express an opinion, but they don't know what they're talking about. So I've had to fight against that. The 4 rules for debunkers: don't bother me with the facts my mind's made up. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. And who's going to know the difference anyway? So I'm dealing with that all the time, and I come up with my own acronyms. SETI, which is supposed to stand for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, it really stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. It's kind of, there's a chapter in my book, Flying Saucers and Science, about this, but the SETI cultists presume that there are beings, intelligent beings out there. I don't argue with that, but they presume that those people are sending us signals using technology appropriate to us. Now, I don't use a slide rule anymore. Our first long-distance radio signal, Marconi, received in Newfoundland, and I live in Canada, so I'm proud of that. I'm a dual citizen. I can complain about both governments. Don't worry.
Good.
And I do. But our first radio signal, 1901, the planet's been around 4 billion years. Nobody got started before we did? That's ridiculous. And one of my mantras, if you can call it that, is that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. A laser isn't just a better light bulb. They both produce lights, but entirely different physics, frankly. And everywhere you look, a little microchip is not a small vacuum tube. You remember what vacuum tubes are like, don't you?
I do.
Yes. So I have had great fun. I also discovered something about myself, that I enjoyed being on the stage. I'm a Leo. What do you expect?
Yeah.
You didn't think you're going to get into astrology, did you?
No, this is exactly it. Remember, in the beginning, I asked, what archetype do you identify with? And so here we are. There's the guy on the stage, and you've got the whole world as your stage, And what
Yes.
you're telling them is these four things. That's your message.
Well, yeah, and I find I enjoy myself, and also I have discovered something that many people don't seem to be aware of, that sightings are much more common than people think. At the end of most of my lectures, I get the first question. I ask people, how many people here, they've just heard my lecture now, believe that they have seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? We didn't let the CIA in, I'll tell them. I just want to point and count. I'm not asking names. So raise your hand. Well, at first, the ones on my left, the hand barely goes up over the head. Each one thinks he's the only one, you know. And 1, 2, 3, 4, I start counting, going around. By the time I get over the far side of the room, the hands go up vigorously. It's 10% of the audience. But then I ask a question. How many of you reported what you saw? Whoops, 90% of the hands go down. And I tried an interesting experiment in a classroom with the professor's cooperation. I said, I'd like you students to vote on a couple of questions, but with your eyes closed, so you're not influenced by the other people in the room. And the professor will count the votes, since presumably I'm sort of biased. I only asked two questions. How many believe that most people don't believe in flying saucers? 80% of the students said yes to that. Most people don't believe in UFOs. How many of you do believe in UFOs? 80%.
Pluralistic ignorance, yes.
Yes.
And also, I've found a couple of other, I'm a little sneaky. If I usually talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and after each one, I show some slides. You remember slides, don't you? Well, I use PowerPoint, but there's still slides. You know, how many, I ask them, how many, after each one, I tell them about what's in the report, then how many of you have read this? I'm lucky if it's 2% have read any of them. So I have no qualms. I'll never forget, in Pittsburgh, I was at Gulf Research Labs. It was a dinner and a talk, and a guy interrupted me 3 times. Finally, the boss man at the dinner says, let him finish. Okay, so I finish, and I turn to the debunker. Well, I'm sure one could come to other conclusions than the ones you've come to. I said, well, let me see now. As I recall, you hadn't read any of those 5 large-scale scientific studies, right? No, that's true. I've read them all. I gave you my opinion. I referred you to the evidence on which I base my opinion. You haven't read any of them. Whose opinion's worth more? Long silence. I wasn't nasty. But what I'm saying is I don't think you're entitled to an opinion if you haven't studied the evidence, darn it. Something else I find has changed. This has definitely changed during my lecture lifetime, if you will. Nobody tells me anymore we must be the only ones. You know, 50 years ago, there were plenty of people who said this is the only solar system. If there were more planets, we would know about them. We're smart people. Today, thanks to the exquisite Kepler spacecraft, we now know that apparently every star, on the average, there's at least one, some say 1.6, planets per star. Now, there's an implication of that. I get many people, including scientists, saying, well, the nearest these guys would have to come from is 1,000 light years away, right? No. Let me give you some data now. Within 100 light years of here, which is down the street, because the galaxy, the Milky Way, is 100,000 light years across, and the next galaxy is 2 million light years away. But within 100 light years of here, there are about 10,000 stars. That strongly suggests that there are about 10,000 planets. I'm not saying they all have life. They don't need to. Maybe only 5%. 500
Mhm.
within 100 light years. And also, we know that many people are aware that the nearest star to the sun is like 4.3 light years away. Okay, but does that mean no star has a star that any closer than 4.3 light years? No, it doesn't mean that at all. As a matter of fact, in the very famous abduction case of Betty and Barney Hill, about which Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece, and I have written a book called Capture, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, an abduction that took place in 1961 in New Hampshire. There was a star map observed, and a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish figured out the names of the stars on the map, Betty's description of what the pattern looked like. Anyway, the base stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2, that's the Greek letter Zeta, Reticuli, that's the constellation of Reticulum, which means the net. See, now you know a word of Latin. I didn't, but I read it. Now, those two stars are only 39.3 light years from here, but from each other, they're only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 35 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. That means all day long, from a planet around one, you can see the other star. And it's a lot easier to find out the characteristics of the planet and whether there's life there and all that sort of stuff when you got a next-door neighbor like that. And I would suggest that you have a much greater incentive to develop interstellar travel when you got a neighbor around. Let's go see what's happening over there. It depends. It doesn't matter whether you're a good guy or a bad guy. You want to kill who's ever there so you can take them over, or you want to have fun with them and develop trading activities. Who knows? But what I'm getting at is that for most people now, they've come to realize that that our solar system is not unique. Some stars have many planets, some have none, or one, or two, or three, or whatever. And we have 8 or 9, depending on who you believe, whether you count Pluto as a star or not. But what I'm saying is our perception of our great significance. You remember Copernicus, who said the Earth and the other planets go around the sun, and the church said, "No way, Jose." His book was banned for 300 years because he didn't leave us in the middle of the universe. Well, now we know we're not only not in the middle, we're not near the center, we're not important in any large way except to us. Now, I will modify that. It may be that we're important to others for a variety of reasons, one of which would be that we are a threat to the neighborhood. I don't know what kids learn in school today, but in World War II, we nice guy Earthlings killed 50 million of our own kind. Some people say 60, but I'm a very conservative guy, as you can see. We destroyed 1,700 cities. And since the war, we have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. Some people don't believe that. Look it up. We're not nice guys. And nuclear weapons leave residue, and so somebody can tell these idiots have been exploding weapons all over the place. So what I'm saying is that one reason for coming our way is to quarantine us.
Right.
If you were an alien, you wouldn't want us out there. And something else that's new knowledge for people: fission and fusion, 2 different nuclear processes. We didn't discover them until 1938. Now, we didn't demonstrate them until a little later. But I'm a nuclear guy, and I'm proud of being a nuclear guy. I'm not proud of exploding nuclear weapons on anybody. But, can we get someplace else? Well, look at the progression in the amount of energy us Earthlings can control. A big bomb in 1944, right in the middle of the war, was a 10-ton blockbuster. The energy released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. And it took a big B-29 airplane to carry it. That was in 1944. In 1945, our first nuclear device, a fission weapon, atomic bomb if you want to call it that, released the energy of 16,000 tons of TNT. That's a pretty big leap, but we weren't finished, we great guys on Earth. 1952, the first fusion device. Nuclear fusion is what produces essentially all the energy in the universe. All the stars produce their energy by nuclear fusion. Well, our first H-bomb, which is a fusion device, exploded in 1952, released the energy of 10 million tons of dynamite. Think about that for a minute. We go from 10 tons in 1944 to, in 1952, a mere 8 years later, to 10 million tons, and a few years after that, the Russians exploded one that released the energy of 57 million tons of dynamite. One lousy bomb. And I mean that sincerely. I'm not a booster of that. But what I'm saying is, I should think every solar system would not want to be invaded by the idiots down the street. And so I think they would all realize that you can use the energy of fission or fusion for a propulsion system. When I was working at Westinghouse, our reactor produced the energy, well, 1,000, it operated at 1,000 megawatts. Now, Los Alamos built a somewhat larger physically, much more large power-wise. They produced one nuclear fission rocket, tested it, produced the energy, 4,400 megawatts. That's twice the power of Hoover Dam in something less than 8 feet in diameter. So if we could do that in no time flat from finding it, we didn't even discover the neutron until 1932. We're latecomers. So I'm not saying fusion is the ultimate in the universe, because progress comes from doing things differently, and we'll figure out something if we live long enough to do it. But I'm saying it's quite powerful enough to make anybody who comes here want to make sure we stay here and don't take our brand of friendship, which everybody else calls hostility, out there. So we need to take that into account. People say, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, I hate to say it, but it's a no-fly zone, folks. And also, the president doesn't speak for 7 billion Earthlings. Sometimes he has trouble speaking for 315 million Americans, So a lot of things you get forced to think about when you dig into this subject.
So what about disclosure? I know the Alien Cosmic Expo, you're going to be out. They're going to be doing a disclosure panel.
Yeah.
And you're part of that, correct? The disclosure panel?
I don't know if I'm on the disclosure panel or not, but I'll tell you something. I'm not a pro everything should be put out on the table kind of guy. Because having worked under security for 14 years, I don't think everything should be put out on the table. For example, suppose we have learned something that might be useful in the propulsion design of systems with advanced propulsion systems. Should we put that out on the table if the Russians and the Chinese don't put out what they have learned? Maybe we've got a new method for detecting things in the atmosphere, better than radar. Should we tell them about it? We live on a dangerous planet. So, and it's funny. Some people tell me, I talk a lot about Operation Majestic 12, this group set up by President Truman in 1947, I believe. And, excuse me, people say, well, certainly those 12 people would have talked to their wives about what they did. No way. I never told my wife anything classified. be breaking the rules, probably lose my job, and who knows who's listening? Loose lips sink ships. It's true. I remember people using that. I didn't fully appreciate it back then, but in the war. But so secrets can be kept. Well, you know, our first spy satellite was the Corona spy satellite, like the cigar, you know, or like the one of the Toyota models. That was built. Well, we had 12 failures before one worked in the late 50s or early 60s. The first one that worked, the spy satellite, got more information about Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights that preceded it. The Corona was expensive, and we didn't say anything about it for 30 years. People kept it a secret. Another example, during World War II, the Allies broke the German codes. They jump up and down and say, look what we did? Oh, no. Not only did they not release that information at the end of the war, but it was 25 years before they released that, because there were other people using the German Enigma machines and all that sort of stuff. So secrets can be kept. There were 12,000 people at Bletchley Park in England who were tuned in on German military communications, decoded them, translated them, distributed them very carefully to a select small group of people. 12,000 people didn't say a word for 25 years after the war. So secrets can be kept. You know, what bothers me sometimes is that there are a number of academics who think that the only place research gets done is in academia, in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Well, it sounds good, but there's a tremendous amount of work going on in industry and in the national labs, and where the stuff isn't published in scientific journals. Technical reports, oftentimes classified. You know, look, to give you an idea that we're not talking peanuts here, when I was working at General Electric on nuclear airplanes in 1958, when I first read about flying saucers, our program that year spent $100 million. It employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. $100 million was a lot of money in 1958. You might say it's a lot of money now, too, but, you know.
It was really a lot back then, yes.
But what I'm saying is, for those who innocently think that, you know, science is what goes on at universities, and that, you know, a few professors and a bunch of grad students, that's what science is all about. Well, sorry, that's not the way the world is. Lockheed spent $10 billion in over 10 years to develop stealth aircraft. That's a big program.
So,
yeah. Oh, it's just it's interesting. I was reading Genesis for the Space Age by John Lath, and he talks about how Roosevelt had been contacted by a person who said he was a Venusian, who basically said, you know, stop the nukes and create world peace and that sort of thing. And Roosevelt said, oh, I've got to tell the American people about this. And the Joint Chiefs and the people said, no, wait, let's. We think there'll be a panic. And what they went out and did was staged this thing for Roosevelt, where they hired Orson Welles to do H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, and there was a panic. And after that, Roosevelt started the secrecy policy. Well, we better not tell the American people, like I was going to do, and that got passed on to Truman for his MJ-12. And but that at one point, this was a staging to just fool the president into keeping it secret. I just wonder what you thought of that story.
I don't think much of it. Orson Welles was 1938, and I think That was before we started spending huge amounts of money on stuff.
Uh-huh.
But who was talking about aliens in 1938? A few science fiction writers, I'll grant you that, but not generally part of the belief system of the world around. And growing up in New Jersey, should I take pride in the fact that New Jersey was the most densely populated state, and that's where the panic took place? Grover's Mill.
Wow.
And it's funny. There was a book came out a few years ago, talking about Dr. Mengele, Dr. Death, worked with Joseph Stalin to develop some badly formed Earthlings, and they crashed a saucer near Roswell to cause panic. Well, I mean, there ain't nobody there. I hate to tell anybody. Who's going to panic? The cattle? The sheep? It's utterly ridiculous. There are a lot of explanations for Roswell. The real one is that an alien spacecraft crashed and was gathered up, and, we try to figure out what's going on. People forget. Right after the crash, okay, we knew it was alien because bodies were found, okay? But what do these guys want? They're little guys. Maybe they're working with the Chinese against us. Not an irrational thought when you stop to think about it. But how do you tell people what's going on when you don't know what's going on? And, I've come up with a bunch of reasons why aliens would come here. They're radio broadcasters, the weekly show, Idiocy in the Boondocks, or the Earth is a penal colony. They dumped all their bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. Or they're mining engineers.
Alien Interview is this, Alien Interview by Spencer. That's what he says, that the whole thing is it's a penal colony, and it's very, it's very interesting. There's a series of YouTubes and the books, and it's very detailed. But that's something that the New Age community says. This is a penal colony. You don't go to hell. We're already in it.
I like it.
Sartre said this. Sartre said the same thing in No Exit.
Well,
Sartre.
Think of the simple fact, which nobody seems to know, is that the Earth is the densest planet in the solar system. I don't mean the people. That's probably true too. But a cubic foot of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any other planet. And I've had people apparently think that a planet is a planet. They're all the same. Well, no, it's not true. And why do I mention that? Well, because heavy elements are rare in the universe, and we know from studying the stars that there's not a lot of heavy stuff out there. I'm talking about things like osmium, rhenium, platinum, gold, uranium. They're heavy. People used to say, when I was a kid, heavy as lead, light as balsa, right? Well, osmium, I wish I had some, but I don't, is twice as heavy as lead. In other words, a cubic foot of osmium weighs twice as much as a cubic foot of lead. And we don't know what all is going on here. In other words, uranium, 100 years ago, its major use was as yellow coloring agent for dinnerware. That's illegal now, of course, because it's radioactive. But, and that's not what it's used for now, is what I'm saying. So we don't know how many goodies there are here that the aliens might have been mining for years. Get it while you can. Let's go over to Earth and get some diamonds. They wash off into the ocean. We have over 1,000 reports of unidentified submerged objects going into and out of the ocean. What are those guys doing down there anyway? Stealing the metals that are on the floor. Well, they might be stealing the metals that are on the floor of the ocean, or the diamonds that washed in from Africa, or who knows. A good fish restaurant might be down there.
I have a comment, and then you go next. We're going to be coming up on a break here soon. I have a friend who's a whistleblower, and she says that there were 5 craft delivered same time as Roswell, that first part of July, 1947, and they were like a Trojan horse, the Trojan horses. So there was a full one and a crashed one, and they took the full one into Area 51. And it's like spying on the United States, and they have 5 of them, so they're in a grid, so they cover the whole planet. What do you think of that?
Well, you know that Area 51 wasn't built until 1955.
Well, later on, yeah, they said later on it was, but originally, I don't know where it was in the 40s. They kept it somewhere, but then eventually it ended up 51.
Well,
or somewhere, maybe S4 or something. I forget what they said. I don't have the. I'm trying to get this interview, but the person won't come out. Yeah.
Couldn't you get the guy who runs the place to admit that?
Well, you know, you talk about the, you know, you have a promise to not tell. You sign a contract, so that's the problem. They don't usually talk until they're on your desk door. Yeah, so.
Well, the thing is that we would love to think that we're big shots. We got our own neighborhood here, you know. But if you think of how many planets there are in the neighborhood, it doesn't seem very likely. I mean, I'll admit, Pat Robertson said, all the intelligent people in the universe are right here on planet Earth. This UFO stuff is the work of the devil. I hate to say it, but I don't believe that.
Yeah.
He also says the world was created in 4004 BC. And I don't believe that either, because there's an enormous amount of evidence that it's, you know, he left out 6 zeros. What the heck?
What the heck? So what do you think of, you know, Contact in the Desert has people covering the alien connection on Earth, you know, back hundreds of thousands of years. Cremo goes back millions of years. He won't be at this one, but there's all these different researchers that go into the ancient astronaut, ancient aliens theory, and then we go all the way to the modern area of Roswell. What do you think? What do you think is true and what isn't true from your research?
Well,
does it go back thousands of years?
I would recommend a book. Dr. Barry Downing has a bachelor's in physics and a doctor of divinity. Divine physics is his beat. He was a minister in New York for 30-some years, still around. Consultant to MUFON. He wrote a wonderful book called Flying Saucers and the Bible. And he traces back through the Old and New Testaments stories, you know, Ezekiel's wheel and the parting of the Red Sea, and just a whole slew of stuff. And there is early artwork that shows things in the sky, and you wonder, why is that in that painting? I think they've been checking us out for some time, and it may be a regularly scheduled event, you know, every 30 years, see what progress the idiots have made kind of thing. So I don't know. I think there may have been civilizations hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago here. Maybe an asteroid here, a nuclear explosion there. You know, who knows? The thing is, they're here now. That's what concerns me. And reports, look, as I said, I've lectured all over the world, and people are interested everywhere. And, you know, let me give you an example of interest. Every year at Roswell, there is an annual festival, early July, this year from the 1st through the 3rd, I guess. And they have speakers, and the museum has vendors sitting all around, and panels, and their parades and stuff like that.
Hold that thought. We'll come back and talk more about the Roswell annual event. Okay, we'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you. Aloha, and you're back. And this is The Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio. And I'm Janet Kira Lessin with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin, and we are interviewing Stanton T. Friedman. And before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go over to that button on freedomslips.com and make your donation. $1, $5, $15, $20, whatever you donate is greatly appreciated. And we do thank you very much for your donation. Stanton, before we left on the break,
Yes.
We were talking about the Roswell event. Could you tell us about that, and are you going to be there this year?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to be there. It's 3 days, and there are panels and lectures and so forth. And to indicate the interest, last year there were about just under 10,000 for the festival. The museum is open all year. Well, it's closed on Christmas, I think, and one other holiday, I think. But it's open all year. And last year, there were 184,000 visitors to the museum. Now,
Wow.
you say, well, but, you know, it's easy to be impressed by that when you find out that Roswell isn't on the way to anywhere. It's 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from Amarillo, and 200 miles from El Paso. And that's an awful lot of people. It's a town of only 50,000. And after the war, when Roswell happened, it was only 25,000. And it's at 3,500 feet, which means the sun beats down on you there, folks. It's dry. It's desert. But you know, for people come from all over the world, literally. I mean, and everywhere that I've lectured, from Australia to Saudi Arabia, people ask me about Roswell. But that's an indication of interest. You know, if it was in Albuquerque, well, it's a main east-west highway. There, you know, millions of people drive by there every year, but not Roswell. So it's an indication of people being interested. Now, some people complain, oh, they have parades and costume contests. Look, an awful lot of the people who go there bring their families. You got to have something for the kids to do. You know, they're not going to sit through lectures and stuff. And so I enjoy the parades, frankly, waving at the kids on the sidewalks. You know, I'm in a car. It's kind of neat. And I like New Mexico. It does get hot in the summertime. And you can get a heck of a sunburn. If you want a fast sunburn, boy, go to Roswell.
Roswell. Is there something special about the energy there? I mean, is there any reason why the crash was there and not, 100 miles away?
The crash took place about 75 miles north of Roswell. And I'd have to say yes in the general sense that New Mexico at that time was the only place where an atomic bomb had been exploded. It was the only place in the United States where they were firing captured German V-2 rockets at White Sands Missile Range. And both of these things are done there because there's so few people there. You don't even worry about clobbering anybody when you explode a bomb. It's a long way from any place. Now, also, 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States are in New Mexico. And so I can see why when you do your survey flying around the planet and you see all those cities that are destroyed in Europe, and, there was no damage in North America, so they must be the guys who were exploding the bombs someplace else. Nobody exploded any bombs on them. I'm glad of that, incidentally, having grown up in the United States. So I think that it would be natural to find the only place on the planet. Remember, the Russians didn't have a nuclear weapon until 1949. So New Mexico was the only place that had nuclear weapons. That's the people who want to debunk Roswell always forget to tell you, oh, by the way, the military group at the Roswell Army Airfield, later called Walker Air Force Base, was the most elite military group in the entire world because they did drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 more in 1946 at Operation Crossroads in the Pacific. High security levels for everybody, security clearances, and the only place that had nuclear weapons. And so it was unique in that sense.
Yeah. Now,
And-
do you think that the Roswell craft was brought down, or was it an accident? My whistleblower says there's no way it's an accident or brought down because, they can just kind of blink it out. So they said it was an intentional in order to upgrade
I don't think
humanity's technology.
I've heard that story, but I don't believe it. I think that my scenario, because there was another crash at the same time over in the plains of San Augustine, which is west of where the Corona crash was, and where the Large Array Radio Telescope is, as a matter of fact. And it was there because the radio noise level is very, very low because there's nobody out there. No, I think that there was my scenario, if you will. We know that we know that they were firing rockets in New Mexico, over in the White Sands area, and we know that the radars were all vacuum tube radars. The transistor hadn't been invented yet, I might add. And that's important because the standard practice was to leave the radar on because otherwise you need to warm it up. Now, we know that there were launches scheduled a few days before Roswell happened. So my scenario is that you have a pilot and a wingman, alien of course, flying along, and they run into this radar beam that's just sitting there. It's not circling around and round and round. It's just on. And maybe you kill a pigeon or two, And suddenly there's a discombobulation of the guidance system or the propulsion system, and you have a brief mid-air collision. And I asked a retired Air Force general, if you have an Air Force in-flight collision between two vehicles, do they usually survive at the same level? No, usually one makes it and one doesn't. So one goes this way and explodes over the Roswell crash site, which is really near the town of Corona. And the reason I say explodes there is because when I first talked to Major Marcel, the intelligence officer for this very elite military group, he told me he was out at this. He was sent out to check things out because the rancher had brought in some wreckage, which was very, very strange. And the boss of the base sent out Major Marcel and the counterintelligence corps guy, because they were worried about who's spying on us as the only atomic bombing group in the entire world. And the thing is that when you get out there, you see there's nothing around. There's nothing that distinguishes the area. But I don't know where I was going with that thought. I just got old. No.
No, you're doing great. You're doing great. So, okay, I had a question. So, do you have a question, Sash? I lost my train of thought too. I was just so mesmerized by what you were saying. So you got there was nothing there. He brought in the stuff. He had to go out and investigate.
Oh,
so,
yeah. I was talking about a mid-air collision because when I talked to Jesse Marcel, in my first conversation with him, and you talk about foreordained or something unexpected, my conversation with him was, well, very simple. I was in Louisiana, Baton Rouge, to give a lecture at Louisiana State University. And I did 3 interviews that afternoon, supposed to do 3 at the major television station. And I did the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. No cell phones then, So the station manager's giving me coffee, and he's looking at his watch. He knows I got other people to see. And out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. Brilliant investigator that I am. I said, who's he? Oh, his next sentence changed my life. He handled pieces of the wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in. What? Where'd that come from?
My goodness.
Totally
Wow.
out of left field. And he wasn't joking. There wasn't anybody around. He wasn't laughing. I said, well, what do you know about him? Well, he lives in Houma. That's a city in Louisiana, but I didn't know that. He said, we're old ham radio buddies. He's a good guy. You ought to talk to him. Okay, the reporter showed up. I was busy. Had a great response that night at the lecture. The next day, I'm at the airport early, and so I call information, get a number for Jesse Marcel, and he tells me his story. And he's one of the people say, well, wasn't it secret? Well, he's one of the few people who couldn't deny his involvement. I found out later. I didn't know it then. This was in 1978. He was the intelligence officer for the 509th, that military special group. And, what can I say about him? I found he was very trustworthy, loyal, honest, all those good things, dependable. And the debunkers never tell you that, the guy who put out the press release was also a bombardier. He dropped 20 raids on Japan. He dropped the instrument package over a test of an atomic bomb in 1946. He was not a dink. So Jesse, in our first conversation, told me he thought it was probably a mid-air explosion. I said, why? He said, well, there was so much material spread out over such a large area, and there was no crater. He'd served in the Pacific. He'd seen where airplanes had crashed, and there's a big hole in the ground. So if you talk about a mid-air explosion, then I like the idea of a collision. One goes this way and explodes, one goes that way and comes down. The one in Plains of St. Augustine hit the ground and stayed in one piece pretty much.
What about the story that they recovered a craft that it was basically pretty much whole and it's still functioning, and some people are saying that they've flown it.
I have
what about
not
that
heard,
story?
Well, it sounds like interesting science fiction. Is the best I can say. From the people I talked to, and my colleague Bill Moore and I, after I found out about Roswell, we found 60 people who were at the base, had been at the base, I should say. And that was a lot of dog work. That was before the internet, So
right.
our phone bills were running pretty darn high, to tell you the truth. And so we talked to a lot of first-hand witnesses. One of the things, if you go to my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, one of the DVDs that's listed is Recollections of Roswell. It has first-hand testimony from 27 first-hand witnesses. They didn't see the crash come down, but they were there for the retrieval operation. And all but one of them are now dead. So it's nice to get first-hand information. And
do you think? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no,
do you think that the beings that were on that Roswell craft are the same race or species that contacted Betty and Barney Hill, or are they different?
Kathleen Martin, who's Betty's niece and who did most of the work on our book, Captured. From what people have said about the bodies at Roswell, they were small and, gray, I'll call them, for want of a better phrase. But I don't know whether they're the same race. Because, again, maybe most of the planets in the neighborhood have been colonized.
Right.
As opposed to developing life indigenously, independently. So I don't know. Remember that we've got a few billion years to play with here. So for all
right.
I know, most of the settlement has happened from colonization and migration, and gradually, there's a crazy question. Why does Earth have people of different colors, different languages, why so many? That's why I like the notion of a place, a penal colony, bringing in people from other places. Why isn't there one type of being here? I don't know.
Yeah, it seems like the grays are only, if you're Zeta Reticulum or something, they're one type, But here we do have all these diverse colors that seem to be the same color, close to each other. Anyway, they could have diversity. We don't know.
We don't know. We don't have any data on, find me 10 other planets with beings on them, and let's check them out and see whether they're all connected or whether they're all independent or there are some crazy combinations of things. Willie Lay, I think it was, many years ago, did a study on what should intelligent life look like, and it comes out the head should be at the top of the body so you can see your enemies. You need 2 eyes so you get depth perception. You need 2 ears so you can find out where they're coming from. It seems reasonable. You need something like a hand in order to create machinery. You need to be able to move, so you need feet. How accurate this is, we don't know because we don't have any other specimens to work with.
Well, what about typical. Betty and Barney Hill? Was anybody ever able to get like an artist rendition of the beings that they saw?
Well, yeah. In the first book, The Interrupted Journey, there's some artwork, and it's not clear whether the artist used his knowledge of human physiology to make up what the aliens looked like. An artist did work with Barney to find out what the aliens looked like, and they were humanoid, practically, no hair, small ears, not much of a mouth, small nose, a big head comparatively, 2 arms, 2 legs. I don't know what their skin was like, what texture it was, or anything else. There's undoubtedly somebody who knows, but it isn't me.
Did they describe the different things that were done to them in the book? I haven't read the book, so I may have read the book. That was a long time ago. Did they go into any detail? Were they looking to Betty as a breeder, or any idea what they were doing to them?
They cut snippets of hair. They stuck a big needle in Betty's belly, and they said it was a pregnancy test. And it wasn't supposed to hurt, and it did. And she yelled, and the guy waved his hand, and the pain went away. They took some sperm from Barney, not in a sexual kind of way. I mean, it wasn't an ecstatic event.
Right.
But they seem to be curious about their physiology. I can just imagine the doctor saying, "Hey, Joe, you need any more specimens today?" "Yeah, we're short of our quota." "Well, I see a vehicle over there. It's got 2 beings in it. Let's see, crank up. Hey, they're different color. One's black, one's white. This is interesting. We haven't seen one of those pairs before. Let's go get them." Specimen gathering.
Yeah. It's a unique specimen, yeah.
You got a quota to fill, and for those people who think that a saucer couldn't crash because, after all, it's an advanced vehicle from someplace else a long ways away, I would point out that the crashes, the close approaches to the ground, a guy named Ted Phillips has collected 5,000 physical trace cases from 80 countries. He was a protege of Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And all those craft were well under 100 feet in diameter. They weren't motherships. On the other hand, we have, remember a case up in the Pacific Northwest area where a civil engineer had 32 eyewitness reports, and you can triangulate. You know, the front end was over the lake, the back end over the mountain, or whatever. And that thing was between 0.6 and 1.2 miles long. So that's the mother.
Wow.
That's big. That's the mothership, if you will.
That's Battlestar Galactica.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, we have a direct analogy. The Navy, which not only has nuclear submarines that can go around the world underwater, in World War II they could stay under for a day, but there are nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, big old monsters, over 1,000 feet long, and they carry about 75 small airplanes. The carriers, nuclear-powered, can operate for 18 years without refueling. The plane's, 2 hours if you're lucky, you know. So people are surprised by that. But if you're a Navy captain, it sure makes a lot of difference if you don't need to worry about gas stations or tankers. You know?
Right.
You go full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes. So
have you ever seen any UFOs personally yourself? When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, so I was there, born in 1954. I left in 89. I would see all kinds of strange craft.
Well,
It was so out
I
there.
hate to say it. I hate to
Yeah?
admit it, but I have never seen a flying saucer or an alien. But remember, I've never seen a neutron or a gamma ray, and I spent 14 years of my life worrying about them too.
Right. Okay.
In other words, you don't need to personally experience something to know that it's real.
Are you aware of the types of sightings in that part of the world? Did you get any reports while you were there?
Oh, sure. We had a
Sightings?
group called UFO Research Institute. We had a couple of dozen, mostly professional people who worked at Westinghouse. We had lecture programs. Look, sightings are common. Everywhere I go, about 10% of the people think they've seen one. So we had reports, no question. And, you know, the fear of ridicule, I hadn't appreciated this growing up, is apparently a major human emotion. People don't do things that are going to bring them ridicule, is the general feeling,
That's
if they
why
can avoid
they
it.
buy designer shoes, designer tennis shoes, because they want to fit in and be not ridiculed.
That's right.
You know, they want
That's
to have
right. So if we didn't have a different attitude, if the press would do its job, one of the many PhD theses that have been done about UFOs is press coverage of them. Dr. Herbert Strentz did his thesis years ago. He read 10,000 clippings about flying saucers, if you can believe. Even I wouldn't want to do that.
That's a lot of work.
You had a question.
Do you have a question, Sash? Okay. Let's see. What are you going to be talking about at Contact in the Desert and at the Alien Cosmic Expo? Dr. Les and I are going to be at both of them. So
wow.
It's a very big month. Yeah, we're speaking at the Alien Cosmic Expo, and we're going to be just kind of hanging around. Might work with the experiencers. We work with experiencers, and they are legion.
Okay.
Yeah. So like Kathleen, and so.
Yeah.
Anyway, what's your part? Because there's going to be a lot of people there.
And at the Contact in the Desert, I know one thing I'm doing is interstellar travel, because there's such wrong information about, you can't get here from there, Stan, don't you know that? Well, you can. Not using a dog sled, but or a helicopter, but I will show pictures of a nuclear rocket or two and talk about there's misinformation out there. I have tried this, and often on campuses I get a chance to do classroom appearances, or a colloquium, fancy way of saying, giving a little talk. And I've tried this. I'll talk about things I don't think they know anything about, because usually a student has warned me that Dr. Jones thinks you're full of baloney or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll talk about the electromagnetic submarine. You're all familiar with that, aren't you? Of course, none of them are. I'll talk about the fission rockets I worked on. They don't know anything about those either. Then I'll ask something that looks straightforward. What's the numerical equivalent of 1G? People talk how much acceleration people can stand and so forth. Everybody says 9.8 meters per second squared, which is true, but I said, how about in units that mean something to people? Because nobody knows about anything else that's measured in meters per second squared, you know. Well, it turns out that 1G is about 21 miles per hour per second. So if we're in a car accelerating at 1G, at the end of 3 seconds, you're going 63 miles an hour. It's a pretty hot car. Most cars take a little longer than that to go there. And then I'll ask, what's the speed of light? Oh, 300,000 kilometers per second. Okay, in more reasonable units, it's, 670 million miles an hour. Now the question, ladies and gentlemen, is how long does it take at 1G to get to the speed of light? It's a multiple choice question. 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, 1 year. How many think it's 1,000 years? Hands go up. How many think it's 100 years? More hands. 10. A few get the right answer, which is 1 year at 1G. Now, they also want you to think that, how do I want to put this, that you can take half an Einstein. Speed of light's a limit. But the other thing he also said and demonstrated, and we know it to be true, is that as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down for things moving that fast. How much? Well, it depends on how fast you go. Now, at 99.99% of the speed of light, you can go 37 light years in 6 months pilot time. You go out, come back, marry your granddaughter's best friend, and life goes on. Well, you know,
wow.
And the thing is, what do we know about going close to the speed of light? Well, that Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland there, expensive and big, and the particles in it are circulated at 99.9999% of the speed of light. So we have some and Mother Nature provides some particles that go 99+% of the speed of light. Strange as that might sound, and we can run experiments, and trust me, time slows down for things moving that fast.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to go, go on.
I was just going to ask, based on all this, do you have any thoughts on the concept that we have a secret space program, that we've been on the moon and Mars? We're looking at the day after Roswell and Portfield Corso stuff, and lately we have Corey Good and Randy Kramer, all those people coming out. What do you think of, do we have a secret space program, or a number of them?
I'm sure some parts of the program are secret, and there's a book called Serpo, and who says guys have been to Mars and so forth. I haven't seen convincing evidence. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. On the other hand, it's kind of like many people, a guy named Dr. Joseph Farrell, for example, say that, the UFOs are the work of Nazi developments. Everybody wanted to build a high-performance aircraft during the war, which is certainly true. And if it's round, it has the advantage it can go in any direction. You don't need to go around and back, you know. But my objection to that is, if Hitler had developed flying saucer, he would have used it. I mean, unless you want to say he was a nice guy and didn't want to hurt his enemies. I can't say that about Hitler. So.
What were the Foo Fighters? What were they fighting? The Foo Fighters fighting? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there were alien craft around. It's like the ghost rockets. The planet was one hell of a mess at that time. The war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that we destroyed 1,700 cities, but we did. There were bombing raids where there were 500 bombers in the air at the same time, dropping bombs. It's monstrous to think about it, but it's true.
Right.
Like it or not. So I have trouble if the United States has developed high performance, I'll call them bombers and fighters and stuff like that. Why haven't we shown them and told the rest of the world, mind your business or we'll beat the heck out of you? However you want to phrase that. And I have trouble. Also, launches to the moon, generally speaking, require a huge vehicle if they're chemical rockets. And I don't think we've developed others fully yet. My feeling about fusion rockets, for example, is if you want to go, all it takes is dough. But lots and lots and lots of money. And I don't see a national effort moving in that direction. It should be a planetary system, I think. So there's an awful lot of stories out there. There's an awful lot of good science fiction out there. That doesn't make it true because it sounds convincing when you read it. So I can't say I can prove that none of this happened, but I've seen no convincing evidence that it did.
What would be convincing evidence?
Well, somebody took a picture. Somebody had some top secret documents that got found in a secret room somewhere, or, where is somebody coming forth who can prove, with Roswell, I always wanted to check to make sure the person was actually there at the time. You can get military records, although it's amazing how many records have been lost somehow. The National Security Agency, many years ago, released 156 top-secret Umbra NSA UFO documents. Well, recent years, and I had a set anyway, you can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. They didn't like my showing a blacked-out document on television. But honest, that I called them I heard that they were releasing a new set of documents, and yes, they are. And I said, "Oh, can I get a copy of the set?" "Sure." "What's your name?" "Stanton Friedman." And "Oh, I know about you." That was a surprising thing to hear from the NSA. Why do they know about me? Well, it turns out that Philip Klass, a big debunker, had told them that Friedman shows that blacked-out justification for not releasing the NSA documents on television and turns the blacked-out pages, and people start laughing and so forth. And so that's why they whited them out instead of blacking them out. But in other words, I can prove that there is a cover-up by showing you blacked-out CIA documents and whited-out NSA documents. And, they're there, and they didn't come from me. You can get your own if you don't believe me. Also, there's something else that people don't know, but I talk about it in my books, I guess. There was an Air Force general named Carol Bolander. He was an engineer working on the lunar excursion module, as a matter of fact. When he was asked by the Air Force, what should we do about UFOs? Because the University of Colorado study, the Condon report, had recommended that Project Blue Book be closed because it wasn't serving any particular purpose with regard to intelligence or science. And so the Air Force asked General Bolander, who had nothing to do with Blue Book, what should we do about it? And so he wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, and I think it was inadvertently released myself, to a guy who made hundreds of requests, and they would sort of grab a handful. Anyway, General Bolander made the following very strange comment in his memo. This memo resulted in the closure of Project Blue Book at the end of 1960. They said, moreover, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. And 2 paragraphs later, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report sightings, but we'll continue to investigate reports which could affect national security. I decided I was going to talk to General Bolander, because that was a shocking statement, because the Air Force has always said Blue Book was it. You know, it was the only group, and there was no national security implication here. So I managed to locate him. It's a lot easier to locate General Carol Bolander than Tom Smith, you know, or Bill Jones or something like that.
Right.
So I called him and I said that I'd had a clearance for 14 years. I was very interested in your memo. I've been very interested in UFOs for a long time. I said, it sounds to me like you were saying that there were two separate communication systems. One for reports which could affect national security, and I told him about a report I'd had just a couple weeks before about a saucer going down the runway at a SAC base where nuclear weapons were stored. And I said, it seems to me by definition that would be a matter that would affect national security. And then if my wife and I are driving down the street and happen to see a flying saucer, big deal. You know, happens all the time. And General Bolander agreed with me. Two separate communication channels. And so most people have no idea that, you know, that there were things that could affect national security which were continued to be investigated long after Blue Book was closed.
Right.
So where is all that stuff? And that's where I bring up Majestic 12, incidentally.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about Majestic 12. When was that formed?
Well, it was formed in September of 1947 because of Roswell. And there were loads of other sightings at the same time in 47. And we got a roll of film in the mail, and one of my associates, I mentioned Bill Moore before, he was working with Jamie Chandray in California, where I had been, and I moved back here. And they get a roll of film in the mail, which has a briefing for President-elect Eisenhower about this group called Majestic 12, set up by Truman in 47. This thing was dated just before, in late 52. I took office in January of 53. And it lists the 12 people who were part of this Operation Majestic 12. I suppose 12 like the Supreme Court. You know, what can I say? I don't know. 12 disciples, whatever you want.
Yeah. Zodiac, whatever.
Yeah, and so the question is whether the document, 8 pages long, is legitimate or not. And to make a long, I've got a whole book, Top Secret Magic, M-A-J-I-C, about Majestic 12 and the research I've done. And it was interesting. One thing that was very worrisome when we got this in 84, late 84, was that it named the 12 original members of MJ-12, half civilian, half military. And all but one of them, it made sense, they would have had high security clearances, certainly the military guys and the first 3 heads of Central Intelligence, people like that. But one of the names on the list was Dr. Donald Menzel. He was a Harvard University professor of astronomy. Now, as far as I know, you don't need a security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard or anyplace else for that matter, you know. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to be very wary about going public with these documents until we checked it out more. So one of the names on the list was a man named Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the head of the Office of really the research and development people during the war. Outstanding scientist and so forth, advisor to presidents and all that sort of thing. And in his papers, I found a letter from an attorney in Boston thanking Dr. Bush for his help in getting charges against Dr. Menzel for being disloyal from being dropped. I mean, getting him off the hook, and they want to take away his security clearance. But it's okay. Now, what did he need a security clearance for? So I checked, and I called the attorney from Boston, and yes, there's about 1,000 pages about that hearing at the Harvard Archives. And I checked, I couldn't find anything in the New York Times or the Washington Post, but I found I had to get permission from 3 different people to go to Harvard, so I did, and I got a grant from the Fund for UFO Research to pay for going over there, and I knew that Menzel's UFO stuff, he was a total debunker. I mean, this is why it didn't make any sense. He wrote 3 anti-UFO books, gave papers saying every sighting has a prosaic explanation, nothing to worry about here. And so how could he be part of a group that knew there were crash saucers, alien bodies, etc.? That was really worrisome. So I got permission from the 3 people that I needed at Harvard and went there, and there's a file, JFK. The UFO stuff was at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, and I've been there, but what is all this about? So I pulled the JFK file, and holy cow, was I shocked. There's a lot of letters, a lot of information from Menzel to John F. Kennedy. They knew each other. Kennedy was on the board of overseers at Harvard, and his area of interest was astronomy, and so Menzel and he worked together. And they even had breakfast together because JFK had an office in Boston and so forth. And there's Menzel writing the president that there's one area where I may be able to help you. Jack had just been elected. That's with regard to the National Security Agency. I've had a longer continuous association with them, 30 years, of anybody in the country with them and the Navy predecessor. When we are properly cleared to each other, he says to the president, I can tell you more. So I did a lot more digging, and I was totally shocked because I didn't like Menzel. I'd had one run-in with him at Harvard, and I was not an admirer, to say the least. But after reading all that I dug into, well, for example, Menzel was a world-class cryptologist. There's a paper written a few years ago where somebody went over all his contributions to cryptology. Nobody knew that. There are 2 issues of Sky and Telescope were devoted to him, dedicated to him, I guess would be a better way of putting it. And neither of those mentioned he did all kinds of highly classified work for different agencies after the war. Everybody knew he'd been in the Navy during the war, but not only cryptology, but other areas. And so that was a real eye-opener. And then I went after the other criticisms, and typical of them, there was a debunker named Philip Klass, wrote several anti-UFO books, and, again, all sightings have prosaic explanations. We talk about him. Kathleen Martin and I have a new book coming out this summer, end of the summer, and we talk a lot about Klass and Dr. Menzel, but to give you an example of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. Now, doesn't that sound neat?
Yes, it does.
Phil complained about a memo that we found, that my colleagues found at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division. The Cutler-Twining memo. Bobby Cutler was was National Security Advisor to Ike, among other things. And Klass approached me with, maybe you didn't notice that memo was written in the large pica type, but the National Security Council, which is mentioned on the memo, only used elite type, and I got 9 of them to prove it, 9 memos. I challenge you, he said, to find any other copies done in the same, any other memos and stuff done in the same size and style type. And I'll pay you $100 each up to a maximum of 10. Ha! Well, he had never, I found out later, he had never been to the Eisenhower Library. I spent weeks there. And I was going there anyway. So first I went to my files and pulled out 20 documents done in the large pica type. Most of them didn't meet all his requirements, but at least it proves they used pica type. He allowed two. And then I was going there. When I got there, I copied 14 documents done in the same size and style type and meeting all his other requirements. Sent him copies and an invoice for $1,000, and he paid me. He didn't tell anybody about paying me, of course. But he told everybody about challenging me. And here's the crazy part. The Eisenhower Library had 250,000 pages of NSC materials. To think that you can generalize from 9 to 250,000 seems to me to be a bit of a stretch. You know,
yes,
and so, but he made that claim. You'd think he knew something about the documents that were there. He didn't know anything about them. He'd never been there. But I enjoyed the $1,000. You know.
Yeah.
So who is motivating this person? Is he self-motivated? Is he being paid by somebody?
Yeah, Phil Klass. He's now deceased, right?
Well, he's now deceased. You know, that's a good question, and we talk about that to some extent in the new book because he was bound and determined. Every sighting had a prosaic explanation, and he even offered, to bribe people in the Travis Walton case.
Woo!
He was constantly doing things. Well, if you want interesting reading, get his FBI file. You can get it through the internet. And he complained to them because J. Allen Hynek had a decent article about UFOs in the FBI magazine, suggesting people send him reports at the Center for UFO Studies. And Klass wrote a really nasty letter about Hynek to the FBI. But it was interesting. They said he's not a fit scientist, he said, and just terrible. And the FBI responded, there's some notes in the file saying that he's a very respectable scientist, and on the side it says Klass twice had released classified material. He was a senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. And he had released classified material, but the Air Force refused to prosecute him because they couldn't afford to make the material to declassify the material.
Wow.
And the FBI had, had strong comments to make about him. And he was a real troublemaker, and the thing is, he was in Washington, D.C., and he was a go-to man. If you needed a debunker, Klass was always available, He's the kind of guy, when we've appeared on several programs, and one of them, the guy tells us that we can't bring anything in with us to do this television interview. And so, okay, we go in. The first thing Phil does is pull a clipping out of his pocket. That's so typical. And he would often do things like that. And so what his motivation is, to show he was smarter than other people, I don't know. He talked about patriotism. These people are saying the government's covering things up. What a terrible thing to say about the government. I don't know what motivates him, and
it's like this thing in the Ashes experiment. Is this person perceiving things the way he says, or is he deliberately lying and fabricating? Is it unconscious and he believes himself, or is he just deliberately obfuscating and trying to...
I would say deliberate. Certainly would say deliberate. And now, Menzel attacked UFOs, but when I found out he had this very high-level security clearance, then he also had written science fiction. And so he was the only one of that group of 12 who would have been so competent to put out baloney, if you will, And as a matter of fact, his first book, a debunking book, was translated into Russian. Now, you think there was a little objective there?
Mm-hmm.
I do.
When I was at Penn State, there was, I think it was your book, you mentioned the recording secretary for MJ-12, who later became the president of Penn State University. Are you familiar with the...
Dr. Walker, yes. That was
yes,
Dr. Walker.
One day, I was working at Penn State in I'd say it was 92 or 93, and I was given a paper to deliver, and it was to Dr. Walker's office, and I was to just leave it in the box. So I had access to this office and left it in the box, and I had read about him in your book. So, I mean, he wasn't coming in on a daily basis. He was quite elderly at that time, but there I was. It was quite synchronous. Tell me a little bit about what was his role and who was he?
Well, he served on a number of committees and some of them research and development committees, and so it made sense that he would know something from the positions that he had. I mean, people with high-level security clearances don't go waving them around,
No.
But you can find out by what they're doing, or if a guy was previously the director of Central Intelligence, he had a high-level security clearance. He doesn't need to say
right.
so. So Dr. Eric Walker, I think his name was.
Eric, you're right, Eric Walker, yes.
And so I don't know what all he knew, except that he probably attended meetings at which things were discussed. And there's a Dr. Sarbacher who served on some of these committees, and he mentioned going to meetings at Wright-Patterson, places like that. He didn't give away any classified information, but it was clear that he had appropriate clearances from the other things that he did. So I would love for any of these people to come forward and talk to me. Those guys are probably all dead. I mean, the really old timers. But UFOs haven't stopped flying over the United States or the rest of the world. The Mutual UFO Network gets roughly 1,000 sighting reports a month. And most people don't report their sightings. So
right.
There's a lot going on. And
I had dozens, and or hundreds, and I've never reported any of them. So there you go. Over my lifetime.
Well, yeah, you see my point. And there's a lesson there. If you want people to not get into serious discussions, throw up the ridicule factor and make them feel that they dare not speak out. I've had professors tell me they'd lose tenure if anybody knew they were interested in this subject. Isn't that a sad commentary?
Yeah, they do. When I was at Penn State, I did report something to MUFON, and I met with the local director there, and this is back in the early 90s, and he said that Dr. Walker had a long interview with him and basically kind of confessed to just about everything, but then when he went back the next time, he said, changed my mind, I'm not talking about anything. So, well, I don't know if that's true or not, but
I don't know either, but I do know that depending on the tenure of the times, most people who've had high-level security clearances don't talk about it, partly because your families get threatened. And you're putting people at risk that you love. I mean, the sheriff's granddaughter in Roswell, she was visiting her grandmother while she was in college. This is years ago, but I heard about it. And there had been a television show on UFOs, and the grandmother says, Barbara, I never told you, but when your granddad was sheriff, he was threatened in no uncertain terms by the government agents not to talk about what he saw when he was out checking on that Marceau report. And we were threatened with death. And Barbara is horrified. Did you believe them? And the grandmother says, I was there, Barbara. Yes, I believed them. And I've heard
How
other
were they going to
people.
kill them? Would they shoot them? Would they?
They didn't, but how they would have, I don't know. They didn't tell me their plans. But I've heard that same thing from a young guy who was at Roswell and was asked to help recover a body from one of the crash things, and he was only 18, big, strong guy, and when he came back, he was debriefed and threatened. If you ever talk about what you saw, we will kill you and we will kill your family. And believe me, he was serious when he mentioned that. So I know it sounds terrible. How could a loyal American believe such stuff? Believe me, it's believable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we have 4 more minutes. What would you like to focus on to tell our listeners?
Well, I'd like to make clear to people that my books are available, that my schedule is available. They're all at my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. And one thing you get from me that you won't get from Amazon, a lot of my books are sold at Amazon, but is you get an autograph. Whenever I send out a book, I personally autograph it. And there are several books, and there'll be a new one. Keep your eye out this summer for a new book. And, you know, this is by Kathleen Marden and myself. And Kathleen is an expert on abduction cases and stuff, and trained as this, you know, she was a teacher, good solid background, not just because she was Betty Hill's niece.
Oh, we've met Kathleen and interviewed her. She's wonderful. She's very knowledgeable and clear, you know. She knows her stuff.
Yeah, very sensible person, and she tried her darnedest to show that Betty had been making up some of the stuff, and found it was true. Betty was not making it up. And,
wow.
You know, people stop and think for a minute. In 1963, let's say, 2 years after the event, a mixed race couple in New Hampshire is going to look for publicity? Sorry.
Right.
I mean, it makes no sense when you stop to think about it. At that time,
no, I think I heard that it was tragic, the pressure on this couple after this.
Well, there was a lot of pressure, and Barney died in 1968, I guess. And the book came out 2 years before that. And the book came out only not because they wanted publicity, but because somebody surreptitiously taped a little presentation that they'd made and gave it to a reporter from a Boston paper. And he wrote an article. He wanted to interview Betty and Barney, and they said, no way. They thought they'd lose their jobs. Betty was a social worker. Barney worked for the post office, but was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission, and they were invited, and Kathy went with them, as a matter of fact, to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. And at that time, if they had stayed at a motel in Virginia, would have been against the law for Betty and Barney to stay in the same room. Miscegenation rules still were in place. Yeah, so the notion that they were seeking publicity is nonsense. Also, the thing about that case that's so very important is that the psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, was a world-class expert on PTSD, shell-shock war veterans, they called them back then. But he ran a hospital that had 3,000 beds for guys coming back from the Second World War with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he has said in writing that their emotional, the strength of their emotional reliving of the experience under hypnosis was every bit as strong as from these shell-shock war veterans that he had worked for. Coming from him, that means something. You know, that's not just a casual opinion.
And that's the end of our show. Thank you,
Thank
Stanton
you so much.
Friedman,
Thank you
for
very much.
joining us today. We will see you at Contact in the Desert and Alien Cosmic Expo.
Yes, you will. Thanks much,
Love and
guys.
blessings. Thank you.
Okay.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Bye.
Bye.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern in Studio A. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.